Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is August 16th, 2017. I think it's kind of important to have a little discussion and explanation here of where we currently stand. I know that there's massive conflicts going on right now between the left and the right, and as a libertarian, as many other libertarians who you'll talk to will tell you, we often end up in the middle with both of the sides tossing brickbats back and forth, and we're usually asked to take a side in the whole thing, to pick where we belong. But in relation to this, I think that it's important we should talk about a book called The Fourth Turning, which was published in 1997, written by William Strauss and Neil Howe. This book was actually assigned to a class that I had at university. It was a history course by a history professor who was pretty much an out-and-out socialist or communist or something like that. I'm not sure exactly which of the two he was, but he was definitely not of the right by any means. But the important part about this book is that it talks about generations, and they define a social generation as the aggregate of all people born over a span of roughly 20 years, or about the length of one phase of life. They break down those phases: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and old age. Generations are defined from first birth year to last by looking for cohort groups of this length that share three criteria. First, members of generations share what the authors call an age, location, and history. They encounter key historical events and social trends while occupying the same phase of life. In this view, members of a generation are shaped in lasting ways by the eras they encounter as children and young adults, and they share certain common beliefs and behaviors. Aware of the experiences and traits that they share with their peers, members of a generation would also share a sense of common perceived membership in that generation. So these break down the generations into four what they call turnings. The turnings they title high, an awakening phase, an unraveling phase, and a crisis phase. It's probably obvious to most listeners out there that we are in a crisis phase right now. According to the authors, the fourth turning is a crisis. This is an era of destruction, often involving war, in which institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. After the crisis, civic authority revives, cultural expression redirects toward community purpose, and people begin to locate themselves as members of a larger group. The authors say the previous fourth turning in the U.S. began with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and climaxed with the end of World War II. The GI generation, which they call a hero archetype, came of age during this era. They say their confidence, optimism, and collective outlook epitomized the mood of that era. The authors assert the millennial generation, which they also describe as a hero archetype, show many similar traits to those of the GI youth, which they describe as including rising civic engagement, improving behavior, and collective confidence. Now, I think that most of us would find severe problems with that characterization of the millennial generation right now. Even millennials who I talk to don't agree that that is the case. This does not characterize their behavior. So Howe is often asked, what is the current position for the U.S. cycle? And there are many potential threats that could feed a growing sense of public urgency during fourth turnings. These include terrorist attack, a financial collapse, a major war, nuclear proliferation, environmental crisis, energy shortage, or new civil wars, unfortunately. The generational cycle, however, cannot explain the role or timing of these individual threats, nor can it account for the great events of history, such as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, JFK's assassination, or 9/11. What the generational cycle can do, according to Strauss and Howe, is explain how society is likely to respond to these events in different eras. It is the response, not the initial event, which defines an era, according to the theory. According to Strauss and Howe, the crisis period lasts for approximately 20 years. So, if it started when Howe thinks in 2008, we have somewhere around a decade remaining in this period of crisis. Obviously, there are a lot of really, really bad things that could take place during this crisis phase. The main problem that we have right now is that no one is actually talking to each other. They're talking across each other. They're talking about each other. And they are having violent conflicts with one another anytime they're in close proximity. And because of that, it's probably important to look at the types of wars that often take place at each one of these phases, because wars can take place in a first turning, second turning, third, or fourth. So in a first turning, the type of wars that take place are restorative. In a second turning, they're often controversial. That would be like a Vietnam War, or inconclusive for the third phase. And then the fourth turning is often a total war. And the primary reason for the recording that I'm making right now is we really need to be aware that we need to push back against this impulse you're constantly hearing about right now to somehow amend the First Amendment to suppress free speech. Because when you suppress free speech, you end up pushing what some would call dangerous ideas or really bad ideas underground, and then those end up reemerging in the form of violence. This is how you brew terrorists, homegrown terrorists, the lone wolf types. You end up creating a Unabomber. You end up creating a Timothy McVeigh type. We always have to take any chance we can get to defend free speech. For example, Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, he's been allowed to speak publicly for years, and it isn't really a problem. I mean, the guy, he, calls whites white devils. Doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me at all. Doesn't mean anything. So you have to also allow speech that may be similar to that on the other side, as reprehensible and repulsive as it may be. But the Black Panthers, they're allowed to gather. They can get permits. They can protest and all these things. And it shouldn't be a problem for a free society to allow things like that to take place. It's when you silence it, when you silence dissent, when you push it underground, it ends up with Black Panthers blowing things up, killing people. Murders have taken place by the Black Panther Party before. Everybody knows about this. And we have this recent incident where a right-wing group had a guy out there who apparently did commit murder, as far as we know right now. But also, when people look into his past, they find that he's a former member of Occupy Wall Street, that he supposedly voted for Obama, according to many reports. The event's organizer also was a Occupy Wall Street. There are some very strange things going on with this case, and I still don't think that we have all the details that we need to have to assess the situation, but really it doesn't matter anymore, because it's all been handed over to the mainstream media, and they get to dictate the pace of the debate now. It's up to the other side to push back against that, we who are for free speech. And you can still condemn, obviously, the events that took place. It was nightmarish. It was horrific. And it started on Friday night with the stupid display of the torches. Made no sense. This was like basically slapping the other side in the face and then expecting them to do nothing. I know it wasn't actual, physical or anything like that, but you know how violent Antifa is already. You already know that when you go into a state that's controlled by Democrats, you go into a city that's controlled by Democrats, you should know from the outset they're going to tell the police to stand down. They are not going to help. They are not going to separate the groups. They're not going to do anything that stops the violence. So you have to be prepared for that on the front end. Why not pick better locations to go to? Why not go to a Republican state with a Republican city, a Republican mayor? where they'll actually get police involvement and separate the groups, allow free speech to take place. You can film it, put it up on the internet, and then move on. And you don't have to have all this the silliness, with the filling cans with concrete, throwing them at people. Antifa has been showing up, basically biological warfare. They've shown up with water balloons that are full of urine and feces that they throw at people. They're macing people in the face. This is it's fundamentally not American. It's not really even traditional leftism. I mean, traditional leftists, protests haven't been like that. They weren't like that in the 60s and 70s. So why have they switched over to this now? I don't know. I think that it sets a series of very bad, very dangerous precedents. But a lot of it has been stoked and stirred up by the mainstream media. I mean, they don't do any pushback against it at all. I mean, often they either brush past it or they lie and call it peaceful when it obviously wasn't peaceful. To anybody who has pictures or videos or was there in person, they can all attest to what actually took place. So I want to close this out by just making an appeal to rationality, to civilized discourse and debate. And please avoid the violence. Both sides. Both sides are guilty. And the only way we will avoid the total war phase of the fourth turning happening here inside the United States is that we have civility amongst one another. Left, right, libertarians, whatever it is you happen to be. Thanks. Have a nice day.